Simone stood in the hospital doorway, camel coat perfectly pressed. Phone just lowered, lips curving into a thin smile. "Well, good morning." Clara said nothing. She looked down. A man's hand was holding hers, warm, large, not Derek's hand. Grant Harlow opened his eyes, awake instantly. He looked at Clara first, then at Simone. "Miss Adler." "Mr. Harlow." Simone's gaze dropped slowly to where their hands met. Deliberate, unhurried. "I didn't know you were acquainted with Clara." "We met last night." Simone nodded. Her phone buzzed inside her coat pocket. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "I'll let Derek know you're awake." Her voice was smooth. "Pleasant. He's been worried." She turned and left. Clara closed her eyes for 1 second. 7 months pregnant. Just survived an accident on a rain-soaked overpass. Alone. And the man who had been sitting beside her bed through the entire night, not her ex-husband. Not anyone she had ever known. Just the only person who stopped the car. What actually happened on that overpass last night, and why is Grant Harlow still here? The story starts right now. Stay with it, because you will not want to miss what comes next. The first thing Clara noticed was the smell, clean, antiseptic, that particular kind of silence that only exists in hospitals, the kind that presses against your ears like cotton wool, like the world outside has agreed to wait. She didn't open her eyes right away. She lay still and breathed and tried to remember rain, the overpass, the guardrail coming up too fast in the headlights, and her hands doing something with the wheel that her brain couldn't process quickly enough. Then stillness. Then the rain again, louder because she was standing in it. She had gotten out of the car. She remembered that. She remembered standing on the wet concrete, with her hand pressed to her stomach and her hair flattened against her face, and thinking, with very strange clarity, this is probably not good. She didn't remember much after that. She lay in the hospital silence and told herself to be calm. Calm was practical. Calm was what the situation required. She had become very good at practical calm in the last 8 months. It was the one skill the divorce had reliably given her. Then she felt it. A hand, warm, steady, holding hers with a looseness that was not indifferent, not possessive either, just present. The way someone holds a hand when they have decided to stay and are not asking anyone's permission to do so. She knew immediately it was not her mother's hand. Her mother's hands were small and always cold, even in August. This hand was large, the fingers long, the grip easy. A hand that belonged to someone comfortable with stillness. Clara opened her eyes, white ceiling. Fluorescent light, the old kind, faintly buzzing in a pitch that was just exactly wrong. A curtain, half-drawn, pale blue. A monitor beside her, its green line moving in quiet, obedient waves. A window with gray morning light behind it. She turned her head slowly. The man asleep in the chair beside her bed was not her ex-husband. She had never met him before last night. She was nearly certain of that. His head was tilted back against the chair. Suit jacket still on, collar open, no tie. Dark hair gone silver at the temples in the specific way that looks like accident and costs significant money to look like accident. Strong jaw relaxed in sleep. A face that looked, even resting, like a man accustomed to decisions. She knew his name. Everyone in this city knew his name. Grant Harlow. She had seen it in the business section, the one her ex-husband used to read at breakfast while she talked, and he absorbed precisely nothing. Real estate and logistics. Buildings with his name on them. A particular kind of quiet power that didn't need to announce itself. She stared at him for 5 full seconds. Then she turned toward the door. And there stood Simone, 31 years old. Blowout perfect despite the hour. A camel-colored coat. A coffee cup in one hand, her phone half raised in the other, as if she had been about to take a photograph. Or had already taken one and was deciding what to do with it. Their eyes met across the room. Clara felt her heart do something complicated. Not fear exactly, not fury exactly. Something that lived between both. The feeling of being caught inside a story she had not written and did not recognize. The feeling of waking up in the wrong chapter. Simone's expression held steady for 3 seconds. Then she smiled, thin, controlled. The smile of a woman who has calculated something and is pleased with the result. "Well," Simone said softly, "good morning." Clara did not answer. Grant stirred. His hand tightened briefly around hers. Instinct, not intention. Then he woke the way some people do, not gradually, not the slow surfacing through layers. All at once. His eyes opened and he was immediately, completely present. He looked at Clara first. "You're awake," he said. His voice was low. The relief in it was unguarded and real. Then he noticed Simone in the doorway. Something changed in his face. Not alarm. More like the careful stillness of a man who has just received new information and is deciding what to do with it. "Miss Adler," he said. The word was entirely neutral. "Mr. Harlow." "Equally neutral. I didn't know you were acquainted with Clara." "We met last night," Grant said. Simone's eyes moved slowly downward, to their joined hands. She let her gaze rest there a moment longer than was casual. Grant looked down, released Clara's hand without hurry, without embarrassment, as if the hand-holding had been a simple practical matter that required no commentary. Simone's phone buzzed against her palm. She glanced at it. Something moved across her face. Satisfaction, Clara thought. Or something that looked like satisfaction from a distance. She tucked the phone into her coat pocket. "I'll let Derek know you're awake," Simone said pleasantly. "He's been worried." She left. The room was very quiet. Clara closed her eyes for just a moment. Of all the ways to start a Tuesday, she moved her free hand slowly to her stomach. 7 months. The baby was still, sleeping probably, small and warm and completely unaware of the situation her mother had managed to arrange around her. "How are you feeling?" Grant asked. "I don't know yet," Clara said honestly. "I haven't finished assessing." That was the truest thing she had said in months. Grant reached forward and pressed the call button by the bed. Quietly efficient. No drama about it. "You were in a car accident," he said. "The rain. Your car skidded on the overpass. You were already outside the vehicle when I found you." He paused. "You were standing alone in the rain." She had been alone. The detail landed softly. Like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moved outward, slow and inevitable, and she let them go because fighting them would take energy she did not have. "The baby," she said. The word came out smaller than she intended. "The doctor said she is fine." "Both of you are fine," He knew the baby was a girl. Someone had told him, or he had stayed long enough to learn. She was not sure which was more disorienting. Clara looked at the ceiling and told herself not to cry. Not yet. She did not have the energy. She did not want to do it in front of a stranger who was, for reasons she had not yet assembled into a coherent explanation, holding her hand at 6 in the morning in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and old magazines. "Why are you still here?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, just considering. "Someone should have been," he said. The nurse arrived 2 minutes later, brisk, kind, both at once. She checked the monitors, adjusted something on the IV line, asked Clara standard questions in the tone of a person who has asked them 10,000 times and still means them every single time. Clara answered in order. "No, no. Baby's heart rate has been steady all night," the nurse said. "Dr. Haynes will be in to see you in about an hour." Clara blinked. "Someone called Dr. Haynes?" The nurse glanced toward Grant with a small, careful look. "The gentleman found your emergency contact card in your wallet. Your phone was locked." Clara had put that card in her wallet 6 months ago. Sitting in the parking lot of the pharmacy, staring at a positive test, she had thought, be practical, be organized, prepare for the things you cannot predict. She had not predicted this. She had predicted nothing correctly in 8 months, maybe longer. Grant was standing now, over by the window, his back half turned, giving her what privacy was possible in a hospital room, which was not much privacy, but the gesture of it mattered. She studied the line of his shoulders. After 12 years married to Derek, she had learned to read tension in a man's back the way a sailor reads weather. The particular hunch that meant he was annoyed but would not say so. The set of the jaw that meant she should not ask questions in the next hour. The deliberate relaxation that was actually controlled fury dressed in stillness. Grant's back just looked still. Not performed stillness. Actual stillness. She did not know what to do with that. "Thank you," she said to the still back. He turned. "Don't. Why not?" "Because you'll feel obligated." A pause. "And I didn't do anything that a person shouldn't do." Simple. Stated. No performance layered underneath it. Clara pressed her free hand flat against the blanket. She looked at her left hand. Bare. Had been bare for 4 months. She still noticed. Still reached for the ring sometimes without thinking. That phantom weight. That particular echo of something she used to be. Clara Whitfield. Still her name. It had been her name for so long she had stopped thinking about what it meant. Whether she would keep it or change it back and what either choice said about her. Whether a name was something you held or something that held you. She looked at the primrose on the windowsill. She did not know yet that it had not been there before. She did not yet know that he had brought it. She just knew it was yellow and small and alive in the pale morning light, and that looking at it was easier than looking at anything else in the room. Patrice Caldwell arrived at 8:47 in the morning. Clara heard her before she saw her. Patrice moved through the world with a particular kinetic authority. The specific sound of her shoes on hospital linoleum. The brisk, certain knock that was more announcement than question. She pushed the door open and stopped. Took in the room in one sweep. Grant at the window. The monitors. Clara's face against the pillow. Pale and composed in the specific way of a woman who has decided to be calm because the alternative is unavailable. "No," Patrice said. To no one in particular. Then she crossed the room directly to Clara and took her face in both hands. "Look at me," Patrice said. "I'm looking. You're okay?" "I'm okay." "Baby's okay?" "Baby is okay." Patrice exhaled. One long, full-body exhale that sounded like it had been stored since the phone rang, and she had heard the word hospital in the first 3 seconds of the call. She stood back, looked at Grant with the specific assessment of a woman who is also a nurse and has learned to read people in the time it takes to cross a room. "Patrice Caldwell," she said. "Best friend, nurse, currently the most terrified person in this building. Grant Harlow, he said, the man who found her on the overpass. I know who you are. Her voice was measured, weighing something. I need coffee before I decide how I feel about you. There is a decent machine down the hall, he said. She looked at him for another moment, apparently decided something. I'll be right back, she told Clara and left. Clara and Grant looked at each other. She is going to investigate you, Clara said. I expect so. She will find things. Probably. She is very thorough. I'm not worried, he said simply. Clara looked at him a long moment. She was trying to find the angle. 12 years married to a man with hidden motives had calibrated her toward suspicion the way a compass calibrates toward north. She was looking for the performance, the calculation dressed as kindness, the gesture that was actually an opening move in something she hadn't been told about yet. She didn't find it. That unsettled her more than finding it would have. The morning light came through the window and landed across the foot of the bed. Outside, she could hear the ordinary sounds of a city continuing. Traffic, a siren somewhere distant. The world completely indifferent to the fact that she had skidded off an overpass in the rain at 11 at night and woken up next to a stranger who looked at her like she was someone worth staying for. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. When you stopped on the overpass, what did you actually think? He considered this with what seemed like genuine care. That you were alone, he said, and that you shouldn't be. That's all? At first, a pause. Then I got close enough to hear you talking, and I thought, whoever this woman is, she is something worth stopping for. Clara looked at the ceiling. She was not going to cry. She had made a rule about crying in front of people she did not know, and she was going to enforce it. What was I saying? She asked. When you heard me, you were talking to the baby, he said, telling her what you were going to do differently. A pause. I didn't hear all of it. I didn't want to hear more than you meant to give. She absorbed this. Then Patrice came back with coffee, and the room rearranged itself, and the moment closed the way moments do, neatly and without ceremony. Derek arrived at 9:15. Clara heard him differently than she heard Patrice. Derek's arrival had always been an event, the particular clearing of his throat in a hallway. The way his footsteps were just slightly too deliberate, like a man who was aware of being observed and had decided to look casual about it. He pushed the door open. He looked good. He always looked good. 38 years old, and the years had been easy on him. Clara registered it the way she always did, with the automatic recognition you can't unlearn. And then immediately behind it came the small sting that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to grief. The knowledge that it no longer mattered what he looked like. His eyes went to her, then around the room, then to Grant. Something moved across his face. Grant Harlow, Derek said. Derek. Grant's voice was completely flat, no warmth, no hostility, just a name acknowledged with the minimum investment required. They knew each other. Of course they did. Two men at that level, in this city, in overlapping industries, they would know each other. And from the quality of the silence that formed between them, the knowledge was not pleasant on either side. Derek looked back at Clara. His expression shifted into the one she recognized, the performance of concern. Eyebrows drawn together in the exact right amount. Voice softened at the exact right register. Clara. He moved toward her. Thank God you're all right. I came as soon as I heard. Simone texted you, she said. A half-second pause. She told me what happened, yes. When did she get here? Before you or after? Another pause. Longer. She wanted to check on you, he said. Clara looked at him. She had the sudden, very clear sensation of seeing him the way a stranger might. Not the man she had loved. Not the man who had sat across a mediation table 4 months ago and divided 12 years into spreadsheets. Not even the man who had told her 8 months ago that he was in love with someone else. Just a man. Handsome. Self-conscious. Standing in a hospital room that confused him, trying to perform a role he had relinquished the right to play. I'm fine, Clara said. The baby is fine. You can go. He blinked. Clara, I'm fine, Derek. The words were not angry. They were something quieter than anger, something more final. They surprised her even as she said them, the way certain truths surprise you when they come out fully formed. He glanced at Grant. Grant was looking out the window, his expression uninvested with the specific precision of a man making a deliberate choice. I'd like to speak with you, Derek said to Clara, privately. Today is not the day. I just want to make sure I'm fine. She looked at him steadily. Go, he went. The room was quieter than it had been. Clara noticed her hands were trembling slightly. Not from grief, not from fear of him, from the effort of that. From how much energy it had cost her to say 4 plain words to him without padding them, without qualifying them, without adding the standard I don't mean to be difficult. She had said it. She had not apologized for it. She pressed her palm flat against the blanket and breathed. You all right? Grant asked, still at the window. I don't think I have ever said that to him before, she said. Just go. Without everything around it, how does it feel? She considered the question honestly. Strange, she said. Like a door I didn't know was in the wall. She pressed her other hand to her stomach. The baby moved. Just slightly, something that felt like acknowledgement, like I noticed too. Good, Clara thought. Pay attention. We're going to need that. Dr. Haynes arrived at 10 o'clock and brought order with her. She was 55 and had the manner of a woman who had delivered enough babies and enough bad news to understand that clarity was its own form of kindness. She checked Clara thoroughly. She spoke in complete sentences. She asked Grant to step outside, which he did without comment. She asked Patrice to stay, which Patrice did with visible relief. Baby is perfect, Dr. Haynes said, watching the ultrasound screen. Heart rate excellent. No signs of distress from the impact. She paused. You were very lucky, Clara, I know. What were you doing out alone at 11 at night in that rain? Clara opened her mouth, closed it, because the real answer was not a good answer. The real answer was driving because she couldn't sleep. Driving because the apartment still didn't feel like hers. Driving because she had made the mistake of looking at Derek's social media and seen photographs from a weekend away that she had not known about. Driving because sometimes movement was the only thing that felt like any form of control at all. I needed air, she said. Dr. Haynes looked at her over her glasses with the expression of a woman who has heard that answer before and knows exactly what it means. You can need air inside the apartment, she said. I know, 72 hours bed rest, monitoring only. You can go home tomorrow if everything continues to look good. Okay. And Clara, she set down her clipboard. Her voice was quieter now. Not clinical, human. You have to start asking for help. I mean that medically, and I mean it in every other way, too. Clara nodded. She was very good at nodding. She had been nodding at sensible advice her entire adult life, and then going home and carrying everything alone because asking for help felt like showing a structural weakness in a wall that was already bearing too much weight. After Dr. Haynes left, Patrice climbed up onto the bed beside Clara, which was not a medically sanctioned thing to do, but the nurse on duty saw her do it and said nothing. Sometimes the presence of a person is more therapeutic than the protocol. Tell me what actually happened, Patrice said. So Clara told her. The rain. The way it had come on suddenly just past the hospital interchange. The overpass and the way the car had found the wet patch before she had time to process it. The guardrail. Getting out of the car because the inside of it had felt suddenly like a container she could not tolerate. Standing on the roadside in the rain, her hand on her stomach, thinking unclear thoughts. Grant Harlow's headlights. He stopped, Clara said. Just stopped, got out, walked directly to me. He didn't ask what happened. He just said, "Can you walk?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Then let's get you somewhere safe." Patrice was quiet for a moment. That's it. That's it. He just decided. He just decided. Patrice looked toward the door. Her expression was the particular one she wore when she was processing something she had not yet made up her mind about. She said. The single syllable contained an entire paragraph. Clara looked at the ceiling, and then, because hospital ceilings have a way of pulling things out of you, she started to remember. She didn't want to. Memory doesn't ask for an invitation. Their first apartment, 3 floors up, small. The windows that didn't quite seal, so you could hear rain on the street below through the gap. Derek had called it character. Clara had called it a draft and stuffed a kitchen towel at the base of the front door every winter and never once complained about it out loud. She had loved that apartment. She had loved Derek then, not the idea of him, the actual man. The one who burned toast every morning without noticing. Who stayed up until 2 in the morning reading history books for no professional reason, just because he wanted to. Who had held her hand without speaking at her father's funeral. Just held on. She had thought, sitting beside him in that funeral pew, this is the person who will stay. He had stayed for 12 years. He had left by degrees so gradual she hadn't seen it happening. And now she was 7 months pregnant with his daughter, and she had told him to go, and he had gone, and she was lying in a hospital bed next to a yellow plant she didn't remember being brought, and feeling something complicated about all of it. Patrice squeezed her hand. I keep doing this, Clara said quietly. Running it backward, trying to find the exact moment. What moment? The moment he stopped seeing me. She pressed her lips together. I have gone through it 100 times. The conversations that went nowhere. The trips we talked about and never took. The nights I felt invisible and told myself I was being too sensitive. You weren't being too sensitive, Patrice said. No, I wasn't. She had known that. She had known it for longer than she wanted to admit. But knowing something and letting yourself know it are different things entirely. One lives in your head. The other lives in your chest. And the one in your chest is the one that cost you. He was already gone before I knew he was leaving, Clara said. Yes, I kept making dinners, buying groceries for 2, planning a life with someone who was already planning a different one. Patrice didn't disagree. Because she couldn't. Because it was simply true. There is a particular kind of grief for the past that doesn't announce itself as grief. It comes disguised as revision. Like going back through an old photo album and realizing that the smiles in half the pictures were the kind people pasted on for the camera. Technically real. Fundamentally false. A song you have loved for years that you later learned was written for someone else. The pregnancy announcement, Clara said softly. Clara, I need to. Patrice didn't argue. Clara had found out she was pregnant on a Thursday afternoon. She had sat in the bathroom for 20 minutes, the test in her hand, cycling through every emotion available in rapid sequence. Fear, genuine joy, disbelief, the specific terror of the unprepared. And underneath all of it, something warm and steady and real. Something that felt like, this is happening. This is mine. She had come out of the bathroom planning to tell him carefully. She had bought a small white onesie with an embroidered duck on the front. She had been going to use it as the announcement. She had seen it in a shop window and gone in immediately and held it in her hands and felt the reality of it in a way that nothing else had made her feel yet. She had never used it because Derek had been sitting at the kitchen table when she came out, and the look on his face, preoccupied and slightly turned away even while looking at her, had told her without words that this was not the moment. So she had said, I am going to make pasta for dinner. And he had said, sure. And she had put the duck onesie in the drawer under her winter sweaters and told herself she would wait for the right moment. 3 days later, he told her about Simone. She had called Patrice, who had driven over without asking any questions. They had ended up on the bathroom floor, not by design, just because that was where they had landed. And Patrice had held her while she processed the ending of the life she had thought she was living. She had disclosed the pregnancy in the mediation. Clinical. Present tense. The way you disclose a material fact. Derek had looked across the table, briefly and genuinely stunned, like it had cracked something open in him, like for one moment he had actually seen what he was doing. Then his lawyer had spoken, and he had looked away. I'm done running it, Clara said now. Looking for the crack, there was no single crack. He chose, and now I need to stop looking backward. She pressed her hand to her stomach. The baby kicked, soft, steady, insistent. I am here, I am real. Don't forget about me. Clara took a long, slow breath. She thought, that's right. I don't forget. That's one thing I am absolutely certain I can promise you. Grant came back after lunch. He knocked, which Clara found unexpectedly considerate. He had been gone for several hours, not explaining where, not asking permission, not leaving a message about when he might return. He came back with two things: a paper bag that smelled like the good Vietnamese place 3 blocks from the hospital, and a small potted plant with pale yellow flowers that he set on the windowsill without ceremony. Clara stared at the plant. That's a primrose, she said. I know. Why a primrose? The hospital gift shop had orchids and balloons. He sat down in the chair and began opening the paper bag with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided the most useful thing he can do is ensure a person eats. Neither seemed right. She looked at him. You researched what was near the hospital. Yes. You also somehow acquired specific knowledge about the Vietnamese place. The nurse at the desk is a regular. She was very helpful. Clara almost laughed. It surprised her, the almost law, like a muscle she had forgotten she had, like something she had stored away in a drawer with the duck onesie and had not expected to find again so soon. Mr. Harlow. Grant. She watched him arrange the containers. You don't have to keep being here. I know. Then why? Because I want to be. He looked up. Direct. And because you haven't eaten anything since before the accident and you need to. She wanted to argue with the logic of this. She did not argue. She ate. The food was good, better than it had any right to be in that context. She had forgotten, somewhere in the last 8 months of grief and pregnancy and fundamental restructuring of her entire life, that food could taste like something, that sitting still could feel like relief rather than accumulated obligation. They talked, not about the accident, not about Derek. They talked about small things. The hospital's terrible artwork, which was trying very hard to be calming and achieving only a kind of aggressive beige neutrality. The oddly specific collection of magazines from the 90s in the family waiting room. The fluorescent light above her bed that hummed in a pitch that was just exactly wrong, just slightly off from any pitch a human brain could decide to ignore. It was the most normal conversation she had had in months. She had not realized how much she missed normal. Derek arrived again at 2 in the afternoon, this time without Simone. He stood in the doorway looking at the food, the primrose, Grant sitting in the chair with his jacket off, and his sleeves rolled to the forearm in the way of a man who had settled in for the afternoon. Derek's expression went through 3 visible changes in rapid succession. Confusion first, then something territorial he had no right to, and she could see him recognize that he had no right to it, which made it worse. Then the careful composure of a man who has decided to be measured in public. I wanted to check in again, he said. I'm fine, Clara said. Still, I've made arrangements with the building manager to have someone there when you. I have, Patrice has shifts. I've asked my assistant to, Derek. Her voice was even. I don't need your assistant. He looked at Grant. Could you give us a few minutes? Grant looked at Clara, just looked at her, waiting, asking with his eyes and not with his mouth, treating the decision as hers, which was such a simple thing, such an ordinary thing, and yet it landed on her chest with a weight she was not prepared for. "It's fine," she said. Grant stood, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "I'll find coffee," he said, and left without ceremony. Derek closed the door. He did not sit. He stood in the center of the room, in the posture of a man who had rehearsed what he wanted to say, and was now recalibrating to the version of Clara he had found here, which was not the version he had prepared for. "I know this is not the time," he said, "but I want to be involved in the pregnancy, in all the remaining arrangements." "The arrangements," she repeated. "The birth plan, the hospital stay, everything." "You're welcome to be at the birth. If the baby and I decide we want that." A pause. "The baby and you." "Yes, she's my daughter too, Clara, I know." Her voice stayed level. "And she will know you. I want that for her. But don't confuse being her father with having authority over me." He was quiet. She watched him look for the version of her that would soften this, qualify it, apologize for the shape of it, and sand down the edges. The version that would say, "I just mean," or "I don't want to be difficult," or "You know what I'm trying to say." She didn't sand anything. He had been receiving that version of her for 12 years. Softened edges, padded truths, rooms arranged around his comfort. She had done it so automatically she had stopped noticing she was doing it. She noticed now. "Is something happening with Harlow?" he asked. She stared at him. "He found me on the side of a road in the rain," she said. "He called an ambulance. He stayed. He's still here. So are you." Silence. "He is not a good person," Derek said, quietly, carefully, as if he had considered the phrasing. "Tell me what you mean." "He is competitive. He plays the long game. People who don't know him think he's kind." A pause. "Simple. And he is not?" "No one at that level is simple, Clara." She looked at him. She filed this away somewhere honest. Not dismissed, filed. Derek was many things, but he was not stupid, and his assessments of people's professional characters had been, historically, fairly accurate. She owed herself the fairness of considering it. "Neither are you," she said. "Neither am I. I will use my judgment." After he left, she sat in the quiet of the room and felt the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from staying exactly who you are under pressure, from not dissolving when dissolution would have been easier. She had not dissolved. Small victory. Real one. She pressed her palms to the mattress and breathed. Outside the window, the city continued. Gray afternoon, traffic, pigeons on the ledge. The ordinary, unglamorous machinery of the world, completely indifferent to what it meant to her that she had said go and meant it, and held the meaning all the way through. The primrose was still yellow on the windowsill. She looked at it for a while. They kept her until Thursday morning. Patrice stayed Wednesday night, sleeping in the recliner chair with the stubborn certainty of a woman who had decided and could not be argued out of a decision once made. She fell asleep at 11 and did not move. Grant came by late in the afternoon and left before dinner. He did not suggest he would stay the night. He did not position himself as necessary. He came, he stayed a while, he left. On his way out, he set a book on the windowsill next to the primrose. Not a new book. The spine was cracked. The pages had the soft quality of something that had been held many times. She picked it up after he left and looked at the inside front page. In pencil, faint GH, 2019. His book, his own copy. Not bought for the purpose, not wrapped, just left. She set it on the other side of the primrose and looked at both of them for a while and did not know what to do with either. So she did nothing, which seemed like the appropriate response. Patrice slept. Clara did not. At 3 in the morning, she eased out of the bed carefully, one hand on the rail, and went to the bathroom. Stood at the sink. Looked at herself in the mirror above it. She had not particularly liked mirrors in the last 8 months. Not from vanity. She had looked at herself and not recognized the person looking back. The woman in the rented apartment, with the bare left hand and the practiced expressions. The woman who had learned to say, "Okay, fine, thank you," in a tone so convincing she had started to convince herself. Tonight at 3 in the morning, in a hospital bathroom, she looked at herself without the practiced expression. What she saw was tired, really deeply tired, the kind of tired that is not fixed by sleep, the kind that accumulates over years of performing fine for an audience that mostly wasn't paying attention anyway. She looked at her stomach. 7 months. The shape of her had changed so completely this year. Body and life simultaneously restructured. She had not given herself adequate time to notice how much had changed. She had been too busy managing the transition to mourn the person she had been at the start of it. She put her hand on the curve of her stomach. "Hey," she whispered. The baby moved. Just slightly. A small shift, like a person turning over in sleep and resettling. "I need to tell you something," Clara said quietly, "because I might not be able to say it as clearly once everything gets loud again." She stopped, breathed. "I made a mistake. A large one. Not in the way people assume. I loved the right things. I wanted the right things. I wanted a life with a partner and a home, and someone to build things with. Those were not wrong things to want." The fluorescent light hummed. But somewhere along the way, I got confused about what I was allowed to have. I started to believe that my job was to hold everything together for everyone else, and if I held it well enough, it would love me back. She paused. It doesn't work that way. You can't hold so tight that leaving becomes impossible. You can't love someone into staying. I know that now. She looked at her reflection. The tired woman in the mirror looked back at her and did not argue. I don't know how to do this without someone next to me, Clara said. I'm going to have to figure that out. I'm going to make mistakes you will probably eventually need to forgive me for. But I am not going to teach you that you have to disappear to be loved, she breathed. I promise you that one thing. She stood there for a while. The hospital was fully quiet. The 3 in the morning quiet that is different from any other quiet. Dense, almost textured. Like something you could press your hand against and feel resist. She thought about her mother, Beverly, who had stayed in a difficult marriage for 20 years because leaving had felt like failure, who had endured silently and smoothed things over and never once made a fuss about the things she was absorbing, who had told Clara when she was 12 years old, a woman who keeps a calm house is a woman who keeps a life together. Clara had believed her. She had kept so many calm houses. She had kept the apartment clean and the calendar organized and the dinners made and the moods managed and the conversations smooth. She had anticipated needs before they were stated and arranged spaces around them. She had become, without noticing, the kind of woman who rearranges furniture at 2 in the morning because at least furniture can be moved. She looked at herself in the mirror. I deserve better than this. I have always known it. The hardest part is not the leaving. The hardest part is admitting I knew all along. She had known, not about Simone specifically, but she had known that the warmth had drained from their marriage, so slowly she had convinced herself it was natural. The way a room gets cold when the window has been open for months. You stop feeling it because you've been adjusting to it so long. She had walked around in that cold room for years, wearing extra layers, telling herself she wasn't cold. She went back to bed. She did not sleep, but something settled in her that had not been settled before. Not resolution exactly. Not peace. Something more preliminary than either. The feeling of having told the truth in the dark and having survived the telling. Thursday morning, Patrice helped her pack. Grant had arranged a car. He had not asked her. He had simply done it and left a message through the nurse's desk that it was available if she wanted it, and she should say no if she didn't. The phrasing alone was so different from what she was used to that she read the note 3 times. She said yes. Simone appeared one more time, in the corridor, clearly not a coincidence. Clara was moving slowly, one hand pressing against her lower back, Patrice on her other side. The hallway was busy with the ordinary morning traffic of a hospital. Gurneys, staff, the families of people who were getting better and the families of people who were not. Simone fell into step beside her. You look well, Simone said. Thank you. A pause. Then lower, Grant Harlow isn't what he appears. Clara looked at her. I keep being told that, by people who have clear reasons to want me to think poorly of him. Something shifted on Simone's face. A crack in the surface. Just small. Just enough. Derek said the same thing, Clara said. Did you coordinate this? Simone was quiet for a moment, and in that moment something unexpected happened. The composure broke. Not dramatically. Just a small fracture. The kind that appears when a person has been carrying something too long and bumps into the one question that makes the weight suddenly visible. He wasn't supposed to leave you the way he did, Simone said, quietly, oddly. Clara stopped walking. Patrice stopped beside her. What? Claire said. He told me you had already. Simone stopped. Started again. He said the marriage was over, that you had both agreed to end it, that it was mutual. We had not both agreed. Simone's jaw tightened. I know that now. The hallway moved around them, completely indifferent. He told you it was already over, Clara said slowly. Yes, so you thought you weren't doing anything wrong. I thought, the words came out with the careful control of someone who has been holding them a long time. I thought I wasn't the reason. I thought it was already finished. Clara looked at her, this woman, who had been in her head for 8 months as a symbol, a category, the clean villain of the story, standing here in a camel coat with her careful hair, looking like a woman who was also, it turned out, carrying something she had not signed up to carry. He lied to both of us, Clara said. Simone did not answer. She didn't have to. Her apartment felt different when she came back to it. She stood in the doorway for a moment and let the feeling register without trying to name it too quickly. The same IKEA shelves. The same decent couch. Her mother's old kitchen table, which was the one thing in the space that felt genuinely hers. The same functional, non-committal space of a woman who had moved in fast and practically and not particularly lovingly. The same apartment. But she was, she thought, slightly different from the woman who had left it on Tuesday night to drive in the rain. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table. She put her hands flat on the wooden surface and looked at them for a while. He lied to both of us. She had thought for 8 months that the other woman was the other story. the simple explanation. The clean villain the narrative needed. But simple explanations in marriages were almost never the complete truth. Marriages were complicated organisms. The ways they ended were never one person's fault in the clean and satisfying way stories require. That was not an absolution for Derek. He was responsible. He made the choice. He lied to Simone, and he left without fully honesty, and those were his choices, and they had consequences she had been living with for 8 months. But Simone was also, apparently, a woman who had been given false information and had built decisions on it. Clara did not feel generous about this. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. But she felt interested in the actual truth, not the version that made her feel righteous, the real one. The complicated, unglamorous one that didn't sort neatly into heroes and villains and instead left everyone responsible for something and innocent of something else. Her phone rang. Patrice. Checking inside, Clara said. Good. I'm on shift at 6. Call me if anything. I will. I mean it, Clara. I know you mean it. Clara, Patrice, I know. She hung up. She looked at the primrose she had brought home from the hospital. Set it on the kitchen windowsill where it would get the morning light. It looked right there, like it had always been there, like it knew something about windowsills. She opened her laptop, not to look at Derek's social media. She had made a rule about that 6 weeks ago and had mostly kept it, which counted. She opened her email and found her lawyer's address. The divorce agreement had a provision about the baby. A standard provision, drafted quickly in the week after mediation, not fully negotiated. She had signed it when she was still in the shock of early grief, when the mediation room had felt like a place where she was supposed to be small and grateful and not ask for too much, and where getting out quickly had felt more important than getting the terms right. She had been advised to sign it. She had signed it. She now understood, given away several things she should not have, not large things, foundational ones. Visiting provisions that gave Derek broad flexibility without requiring any corresponding flexibility for her. Financial provisions that tied her movements to his schedule in ways that were not explicit enough to argue against, but were real enough to constrain. She had read the document at the time. She had just not yet become the woman who believed she deserved to push back on it. She typed, I need to revisit the custody and visitation framework before the baby arrives. I believe the current terms are not equitable. Can we meet this week? She read it back once, did not soften it, did not add, I hope this isn't an inconvenience or I know this is asking a lot. She sent it. She sat back in the chair. That was the second door she had found in the wall. Grant texted at 6 o'clock. It was a simple message. Hope the homecoming was good. The primrose needs indirect light. She looked at the primrose on the windowsill. She texted back, already on the kitchen windowsill. His reply came back within a minute. Good instinct. She set the phone down, looked at the plant. It was small and yellow and had no idea it was becoming a symbol of something she hadn't fully named yet. She put her hand on her stomach. Your great-grandmother was a practical woman, she said to the baby. She had started talking to her a few weeks ago, conversationally, as if the baby was already a person she was getting to know, which she supposed was true. Her name was Josephine. She raised 3 children alone on a teacher's salary and never once described it as a hardship. She paused. I have been thinking about her name lately, she said. The primrose sat on the windowsill in the early evening light, yellow, quiet, obstinately alive. Outside, the city settled into its evening noises. Traffic thinning. Someone on the street below laughing at something. The ordinary music of a world continuing without reference to her situation. She thought, I am going to be all right. Not yet, but moving toward it. She thought, that is enough for today. Her lawyer's name was Gail Forsyth. She had handled Clara's entire divorce with the competent directness of a woman who had heard every story and was not shocked by any human behavior. She looked at the new request without expression. The terms were agreed to, she said. I know. Changing them will require his agreement or a court decision. I know that too. Gail looked at her across the desk. What changed? I did. A pause. Then Gail smiled. Small, controlled, professional. All right, she said. Let's look at it. They went through the agreement for 2 hours. Clara had her notes. She had made them at the kitchen table the night before, going through the document section by section with the methodical attention she had once applied to marketing campaigns and client briefs. She had been good at her job. She had applied the same rigor to other people's problems for 8 years. Now she was applying it to her own. By the end of the 2 hours, they had identified 4 provisions worth challenging. Not aggressive ones, reasonable ones. The kind a family court judge would likely view favorably given the circumstances. A woman 7 months pregnant, a recent divorce, a child about to arrive into a set of arrangements that the original agreement had drafted hastily and not with adequate foresight. He may agree to some of this without a fight, Gail said. He may not. No, he may not. She closed the folder. Are you prepared for both? Yes, Clara said. She was. Something had changed in her in the hospital. She could not fully articulate what it was. Something had settled and clarified and stopped being negotiable. She was prepared for the difficult version. She was no longer arranging her expectations around the most comfortable possible outcome. Grant called that afternoon, an actual phone call, not a text. It felt slightly formal and also somehow more direct than a text would have been, like he had decided that the situation warranted the commitment of his actual voice. "How are you?" he asked. "Better," she said. "I went to see my lawyer this morning. About the custody framework?" "Yes. Good. Just that. No advice, no cautionary notes, no performance of even-handedness. Derek told me you're not what you appear," she said. A quiet exhale. "He said versions of that before. He said you play the long game." "I'm patient," Grant said. "Those are different things." "Explain the difference." He was quiet a moment, thinking it through rather than reaching for a ready answer. "Playing the long game implies you're managing people toward an outcome you've already fixed," he said. "Being patient means you're willing to wait for the right thing without forcing it into the shape you want." She sat with that. "What are you being patient about?" she asked. Another pause. "Longer than the first, he said finally, "if that's acceptable." She looked at the primrose. "I am 7 months pregnant with another man's child," she said. "I am in the middle of renegotiating a divorce settlement. I am not sleeping consistently. I drove on an overpass in a rainstorm alone at 11 at night less than a week ago. I know all of that. That's a complicated list. I'm aware." "Why would you? Because when I found you on that overpass," he said quietly, "you were standing in the rain talking to your daughter, explaining what you were going to do differently." A pause. "I heard enough to know that whoever you were telling yourself the truth. And I thought, whoever this woman is, she is the most honest person I have seen in a very long time." Clara pressed her lips together. She did not cry. She wanted to, slightly. She didn't. "I'm not ready," she said. "I know. That could mean a long time." "I know that too." She looked at the primrose, small and yellow and entirely unconcerned. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They talked for another 30 minutes. About the book he'd left her, which she had started the night before and found unexpectedly absorbing. About a restaurant she mentioned she had always meant to try, one of those places you drive past for 3 years and somehow never actually go into. About the specific sadness of a hospital gift shop, which is trying so hard to help and can never quite manage it. She fell asleep with the phone still in her hand. She slept for the first time in months without waking once. She did not wake at 3. She did not lie in the dark running the timeline of the marriage. She did not reach for the phantom ring. She just slept. It was extraordinary. She had forgotten it was possible. Eleanor Whitfield arrived on a Saturday morning without calling. She was 63, Derek's mother. She had the manner of a woman who had been beautiful and positioned long enough to believe that both states were permanent features of the landscape. She wore things very well. She moved through rooms as if she owned them, which in several cases she literally did. Clara had always found her frightening in a quiet way. The kind of frightening that doesn't raise its voice. The kind that operates through implication and the careful arrangement of social pressure. She knocked. Clara answered, because Patrice was on shift and she was alone, and the knock was confident enough that she had opened the door before she had thought it through. "Clara," Eleanor said, as if she had been expected. As if she were the one doing Clara a favor by showing up. "Eleanor, I won't stay long." She did not wait to be invited in. She moved into the apartment and looked around it with the specific expression of a woman cataloging what was missing. The bare walls, the functional furniture, the kitchen table that was the only piece with any history, and the primrose on the windowsill. Her gaze paused there briefly. Clara watched her and felt the old familiar contraction, the shrinking that Eleanor had always reliably produced in her, the impulse to explain the apartment, to apologize for the sparseness of it, to say something that would soften Eleanor's visible assessment. She didn't explain anything. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table. Clara sat across from her. "I know Derek was not perfect," Eleanor began. "He wasn't," Clara agreed. Simply. A slight pause. Eleanor had expected a softening, a qualifying, the usual buffer. She recalibrated visibly. "The child is my grandchild," she said. "I intend to be present in her life. You're welcome to know your granddaughter. I also intend to ensure the financial arrangements are appropriate for everyone involved." Clara looked at her steadily. "The financial arrangements are between Derek and me and our respective lawyers. As Derek's mother..." "You're not party to the agreement, Eleanor." Eleanor's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a recalibration. She had known a version of Clara for 12 years. This version was not that version. "I'm also aware," Eleanor said carefully, "that you've been spending time with Grant Harlow." "People keep raising that," Clara said. "I've started finding it interesting. He and Derek have significant business conflicts. I wouldn't want you to be used as a pawn in something you don't fully understand, Eleanor." Clara leaned forward slightly, not aggressive, just clear. The way you are clear when you have decided to be. "I'm a 34-year-old woman who ran a marketing department for 8 years. I understand strategy. I understand when I'm being warned, and I understand what a warning is designed to accomplish. She paused. I make my own decisions. Silence. Eleanor looked at her, truly looked. The way Clara realized she had never fully looked before, as if she were registering a version of Clara that she had not previously bothered to see. Something moved across her face. Not warmth exactly, not apology. Something more particular than either. Acknowledgement. Eleanor Whitfield, who acknowledged almost nothing, looked at Clara across the kitchen table and acknowledged her. You've changed, Eleanor said. Yes, Clara said. I have. They talked for another 20 minutes. Not warmly, not badly. Eleanor made 2 more attempts at various pressures, and Clara met each of them with the same clear, unapologetic directness. And Eleanor, who had not expected that and was genuinely too perceptive to pretend she hadn't noticed, stopped trying. At the door, she turned back. She'll be a strong child, Eleanor said. The she meaning the baby, given her mother. It was the most direct compliment Eleanor Whitfield had ever given her. In 12 years. Clara closed the door. She stood in the hallway alone for a moment. Then she laughed. Out loud, alone, in her rental apartment, with the primrose on the windowsill and the morning light coming through the window in long, pale autumn strips. She laughed until she had to sit down on the floor with her back against the wall, one hand on her stomach, laughing at the sheer extraordinary improbability of all of it. The baby kicked. Clara pressed her palm there and kept laughing. I know, she said. I know. Your grandmother's mother just paid me a compliment. That means something enormous happened in this apartment this morning. The baby kicked again. Clara laughed until the laughing turned into something else briefly, and then turned back into laughing. And then she made herself another cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table in the autumn morning light and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the protagonist of her own life. The baby was born on a Tuesday morning in October. Her name was Josephine. Clara had decided the name alone. Not in protest, not as a declaration, just because she had known it for a while, the way you sometimes know things quietly before you know that you know them. Josephine for her grandmother, the most practically brave woman Clara had ever known, who had raised 3 children on a teacher's salary after her husband left without apology, and who had never once framed that story as a tragedy. She had refused to be a tragedy. Clara intended to refuse as well. The labor lasted 11 hours. Patrice was in the delivery room, holding her hand and talking her through it with the particular fluency of a nurse who understands both the medical and the human dimensions of the experience simultaneously. She said exactly the right things at the right moments, and also several very funny things at the moments when Clara needed to laugh more than she needed anything else. Derek was in the waiting room. He had arrived at 6 in the morning. He had brought coffee for the nurses, which Clara had not expected, and thought was a genuinely good sign for his parenting instincts, whatever else she thought about him. He met Josephine at 11:43 in the morning. Clara watched him hold his daughter for the first time. She watched the precise moment when something moved across his face, something unguarded and genuine, something she had not seen from him in years, the particular undoing that a newborn performs on even the most offended people, the ones who think they are prepared for it and discover they were completely wrong. He looked up at Clara. Thank you, he said, and meant it. She nodded, and meant the nod. The custody framework had been renegotiated by then. Gail had been right. Derek had agreed to most of the changes without significant resistance, whether that was because his lawyer had advised reasonableness, or because something in him had shifted in the weeks since the hospital, or because Simone had told him something she had realized she needed to say Clara didn't know. She had stopped trying to work out the mechanism. The terms now were fair, not perfect, fair, and fair she had decided was enough. She was done confusing perfection with adequacy. She was done holding out for the ideal version of things and missing the real version while she waited. Grant came to the hospital that afternoon. He appeared in the doorway of the room where Clara sat propped against pillows with Josephine asleep against her chest, the particular, extraordinary weight of a sleeping newborn, the smell of her, the way her small face was entirely itself, entirely complete, the face of someone who had never existed before and was now, unmistakably, a person. Grant stood in the doorway and looked at them. He had an expression she had not seen from him before. He had been, for 4 months, composed and patient and consistent, but this expression was something else. This was a man looking at something he had allowed himself to want and finding it real. Hello, he said. Hello, Clara said. He came in quietly. He did not touch Josephine. He did not presume. He sat in the chair, and they were all 3 of them in the same room together, the woman, the man who had stopped on the overpass, and the baby who had been with Clara through every part of all of it, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind you don't need to fill. She looks like you, he said after a while. She has Derek's ears. She looks like you, he said again. Clara looked down at Josephine. the sleeping weight of her, the way her small fist had curled near her cheek in her sleep, the way she breathed with her whole body in the specific way that only newborns breathe, as if breathing were an activity that required full commitment. She had spent 8 months afraid, alone in the fear, moving through it the way you move through water you can see but cannot quite touch. She was still afraid in some ways. That was not over. Fear does not end at a particular date. But underneath the fear, something solid had formed, not certainty. She was done confusing certainty with security. Certainty had been the thing she had told herself she had in her marriage right up until she didn't have it anymore. Something more honest than certainty. Herself. Just herself. Clear-eyed and present and making choices. "Can I ask you something?" she said to Grant. "Yes." "When you stopped on the overpass. What did you actually think when you first saw me?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought she's alone and she shouldn't be," he said. "And someone should fix that." A pause. "And then more honestly, I thought I want to be the one who does." She looked at him. He met her eyes without deflection. "That's honest," she said. "I try to be. I'm learning to be," she said. "I spent a very long time being honest about everything except what I actually needed." He nodded slowly, not filling the space, just listening. "What did you actually need?" he asked. She thought about it for a genuine moment, not the quick answer. "The real one, to be seen," she said. "To be known and seen and not managed around. To be someone whose truth didn't have to be softened before it was delivered." She looked down at Josephine. "And I needed someone who would stop the car, without being asked, without waiting to see if stopping was convenient." He was very still. "I'll keep stopping the car," he said quietly, "if you'll let me." She didn't answer right away. She had learned in the last several months to be careful with yes, to let it form fully before she said it, to make sure it was hers and not a performance of what she thought was wanted from her. She had also learned, and this one was newer and harder, not to mistake caution for wisdom when what it actually was. Sometimes was fear wearing wisdom's coat. She looked at Grant Harlow, a man who had spent 4 months being patient and honest and unhurried, who had asked with a look instead of assuming, who had left his own book rather than buying a new one, who had found out which Vietnamese place the nurse recommended and brought it without mentioning he had looked it up, who had said he was being patient and explained why patience was different from strategy. "I'll think about it," she said. He smiled. "Small and real. That's enough," he said. That was enough. He meant it. She believed him. They talked for another hour, about Josephine's face, which kept changing in the minute-by-minute way of newborns, about the hospital coffee, which was terrible, and Grant had brought her the good kind in a thermos that he had, she noticed, kept at exactly the right temperature, about the way autumn light came through hospital windows at a particular angle that made everything look like a photograph of itself. Josephine woke briefly, looked at the ceiling with the ancient, unfocused gaze of the very newly arrived, decided the ceiling was acceptable, went back to sleep. "She's going to have opinions," Grant said. "She already does," Clara said, and she looked at her daughter and thought, "You came into a hard year. You came in while everything was being taken apart and put back together differently. You were with me on the overpass and in the hospital bathroom and at the kitchen table with the lawyer's document and at the kitchen table with the primrose. You were with me for all of it. Thank you for that," she thought. "Thank you for staying." 3 months later, she was standing in her kitchen, a different kitchen. She had moved in November. The apartment was slightly larger, better light. A kitchen with actual counter space which she had not realized she had missed until she had it again. She had a rocking chair, a crib that had taken Patrice 6 hours to assemble, during which time Patrice had said several things about the instructions that Clara had found deeply entertaining. A primary color mobile that played a song from a children's movie Clara had loved when she was 6 years old. Josephine was 3 months old. She was at this particular moment, in the bouncer in the living room, making the specific sound she made when she was deciding whether to be happy or furious about something, and had not yet committed to either position. Clara stood at the counter and made coffee. She thought about this. 1 year ago, she had been in the house she used to share with Derek, making coffee at this same hour of the morning, standing at a nicer counter in a larger kitchen, in a house that was technically hers but had never quite felt like it. And the feeling in her chest at that hour had been the low-grade, persistent dread of a woman who knows something is wrong and cannot name it, and has been unable to name it for long enough that she has started to wonder whether the dread is simply her, whether she is simply a person who feels dread, whether that is her nature and she should stop expecting otherwise. The feeling in her chest this morning was different, not uncomplicated. She wanted to be accurate about that. She was tired. She was navigating co-parenting with a man she had loved and grieved and was now slowly learning to know as something else entirely. A different category, a person she shared a child with, a role for which there was no adequate template, a role that required constant revision as new situations arose. She was building something with Grant. Something she was refusing to rush and refusing to sabotage with fear, which was the twin temptation she had identified in herself. Rush it because it feels good and she has been alone. Sabotage it because it feels good and she doesn't trust good things. She was trying to do neither. She was learning to ask for help. That one was ongoing. She asked Patrice things she would have previously managed alone. She told her mother when she was struggling instead of reporting only the acceptable version. She had even, twice, told Grant something difficult when it would have been easier to say fine. Both times he had listened. Both times he had not tried to fix it. He had just listened and asked what she needed and done that thing. It was almost annoyingly straightforward. She poured the coffee. The morning light came through the kitchen window and fell across the primrose on the sill. She had kept it. Of course she had kept it. It had bloomed twice since October. Small, persistent, yellow. Completely indifferent to the disruptions of the year. It had earned its place on the windowsill. Josephine made a decision in the living room and began to cry. It was the specific cry that meant, I have feelings about my situation and I need you to come address them. Clara picked up her coffee, went to the living room, scooped the baby up in one arm with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for 3 months and was still, every single time, quietly astonished that it was possible, that she could do this, that it kept working. I know, she said to Josephine, who did not care about her emotional journey and simply needed to be held. I know, you have feelings about it. Your feelings are valid. Josephine's crying softened. She hiccuped, resettled, put her small fist against Clara's shoulder and held on. Clara stood at the window with her coffee and her daughter and looked out at the street below. Autumn had gone to early winter. The trees were bare. The morning light was thin and clear, the kind of light that is cold from a distance but warm when it lands on your face. The street was doing its ordinary morning business. Dog walkers, someone in a heavy coat carrying groceries, a child being shepherded towards school with a backpack that was nearly as large as they were. The ordinary, continuous, unremarkable fact of the world. She had spent so long trying to hold a marriage together that she had forgotten to hold herself. She had arranged her life around a man's comfort until she had made herself so small she had nearly disappeared. She had confused endurance with love, and patience with silence, and keeping the peace with actual peace. She knew better now. Not because someone had taught her. Not from a book or a conversation or a turning point she could identify cleanly. Because she had stood in a hospital bathroom at 3 in the morning and told the truth out loud to her unborn daughter and heard herself say it and finally believed it. I deserved better. I always did. The door was never locked. I was holding it closed. She had been holding it closed with both hands. So carefully, so consistently, she had mistaken the effort of keeping it shut for the weight of something inevitable. The door had been open the whole time. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Grant, good morning. The place near you apparently has a new weekend breakfast menu. Worth investigating if you're interested. She looked at the text. She looked at Josephine, who was now very calm and apparently deeply interested in a point somewhere over Clara's left shoulder. She typed back, Saturday? His reply was immediate, Saturday. She set the phone down. She had a Saturday to look forward to. A small thing, an ordinary thing. A breakfast at a restaurant near her new apartment with a man who stopped the car and waited to be invited in. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a rescue. It was just someone showing up consistently and asking if Saturday worked. And Saturday worked. Josephine grabbed her finger with her whole hand. That particular grip that newborns and young babies deploy. Total, unself-conscious, absolute, no strategy in it, no fear. Just I am holding on because I want to and because you are here, and that is all the reason I need. Clara held on. She thought this is what it actually looks like, not the version she had been taught. Not the quiet endurance and the smoothed edges and the rooms arranged around other people's moods, and the needs stated only indirectly, and the truth delivered only in its softened form. This. The morning light coming through the window. The coffee getting slightly cold on the counter. The baby's weight against her shoulder. The small yellow plant on the windowsill obstinately blooming for the 3rd time in 4 months. The text from a man who asks before assuming. The lawyer who is reviewing the last provision. The best friend who drove over without being asked and assembled a crib for 6 hours and swore fluently at the instructions and stayed. The self she has been meeting slowly and imperfectly and with considerable resistance from all the old habits every morning since October. This she pressed her lips to the top of Josephine's head, the specific warmth of it, the specific smell that was entirely her daughter's and no one else's, and that Clara suspected she would be able to identify in a room of 1,000 people for the rest of her life. We are okay, she said softly. Josephine held her finger. The morning light moved across the floor in its slow, reliable way. We are okay, Clara said again, quieter this time. Not for Josephine, for herself. For the version of herself who had stood in the parking lot of a pharmacy holding a positive test and tried to be practical. For the version who had put the duck onesie in a drawer and waited for a right moment that never came. For the version who had stood in the rain on an overpass at 11 at night, because sometimes movement is the only thing that feels like control. For all the versions, they were okay. For the first time in a very long time, she meant it completely. The primrose sat on the windowsill in the winter morning light, small, yellow, unkillable, something she had not asked for and had not expected and had decided to keep. Something given without strategy and received without obligation and tended to simply because it was alive and deserved the light. She stayed at the window a while longer. There was no hurry. She had learned at considerable cost that there was no hurry. Saturday was coming. The terms were fair. Josephine was here. The door was open. She stood in the light and let herself have the morning.